I still remember the sound that night. A single wooden door slamming open in the blizzard. Then a man's voice, strained and shaking. She can't feel her legs. When I looked inside that abandoned cabin, a young woman lay curled in a broken wheelchair, snow crusted in her hair, lips blue, hands trembling as if trying to hold on to life itself. And beside her, a German shepherd stood guard, growling at something in the dark. But she wasn't always like this. There was a time she walked through life with certainty, surrounded by comfort, blinded by the people who claimed to love her. Until the night fear chased her into the storm. Now she was here, shivering, alone, and the world outside didn't stop. No lights, no voices calling her name, no one coming back for her. Then he appeared, a tall man in an old army field jacket, stepping into the cold without hesitation, as Bear pressed forward like he understood her pain. A silent rescue, a flicker of hope. But what he found next changed everything. Before we begin, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. And tell me, where are you watching from? And how does this opening make you feel? I truly want to see how far this story can travel. The wind came first. A thin, needling cry slipping through the pines like a warning no one wanted to hear. Snow tapped against the tin roof of the ranger shed, soft at first, then harder, as if the whole sky began to breathe faster. And in that rushing breath of winter, the old timber road of Helena stretched out pale and empty beneath a fading afternoon sun. You could smell the cold before it settled, a sharp, metallic scent that stung the inside of the nose and made each exhale look like a ghost departing the body. The mountains stood still, but the world around them trembled. Jonas Hale stepped out from the small porch of his cabin, the snow creaking under his boots in a slow, reluctant hush. He had lived through 2 wars, one printed neatly in his discharge papers, and one that still woke him in the half-light before dawn. The kind of war that never made a sound, but kept bleeding inside. The olive M1965 field jacket on his shoulders had carried him across continents. Now it carried him from one winter day to the next. Bear, his 6-year-old German shepherd with sable-gray fur and dark saddle markings, moved beside him with the quiet vigilance of a seasoned sentinel, ears twitching at sounds Jonas no longer bothered to question. The call had come moments ago. A woman from the volunteer rescue office, her voice clipped with worry, static breaking in and out, said a rental cabin deep in the northern woods had gone silent. No phone signal, no movement. Storm rolling in. A simple request, she'd said. But nothing was ever simple out here, especially in the hours before a Montana blizzard. Jonas locked the cabin door behind him, though he knew no thief in his right mind would wander this far into the cold. It was habit, the kind that forms after loss, a way of holding on to what little the world has left unbroken. Bear circled once, nose lifting into the wind, as though he could smell the urgency hiding behind the drifting flakes. Jonas watched the dog's chest swell, that deep, instinctive breath that always came before something important. "Let's move," Jonas murmured. Not a command, just a recognition of the moment. And Bear fell in step beside him. They took the truck up the old logging trail, tires grinding over patches of ice. Bare aspens whipped past in quick flashes of white and gray. The further north they drove, the darker the world became, as though the storm had been waiting for them specifically. Jonas kept one hand steady on the wheel, his fingers tapping a slow, unconscious rhythm on the jacket patch sewn years ago by a medic who didn't make it home. Bear leaned forward, paws braced, staring into the growing dusk with an alertness Jonas trusted more than his own instincts. When the cabin finally appeared between 2 towering spruces, it looked like a forgotten relic, One window blacked out by snow, the roof sagging under weight it was never built to carry. Jonas cut the engine. For a heartbeat there was only silence, a silence so complete it made the world feel abandoned. Then Bear stiffened. A low vibration traveled from the dog's chest into the cold air. Something was wrong. Jonas grabbed his flashlight. Bear moved first, paws sinking into the snow with quick, deliberate precision. The dog's body tightened, ears standing sharp as carved stone. He paused at the cabin door, nose inches from the frame. Jonas saw the wood fibers splintered at the hinge and the faint sway of the door pushed inward by the wind. Not broken into, just left open, as if someone fled without thinking. And then Bear scratched. Hard. 3 sharp drags of his paws down the door, claws clicking against old wood. His breath fogged in short bursts. Jonas knew that reaction. Not fear, not curiosity. Recognition. He nudged the door open with his shoulder, and the smell hit him first. Cold fabric, stale air, and something faintly metallic, like a coin rubbed between shaking fingers. Jonas lifted the beam of light and let it sweep across the floor. A cracked mug, a pile of clothes thrown against the wall, a dark, overturned wheelchair, one wheel still spinning from the wind slipping through the doorway. The room was small, but the silence inside it was huge. Then the light caught her. A woman, young, mid-20s at most, lay curled on the torn rug near the broken wheelchair. A thin blanket had slipped off her shoulders and pooled at her waist. Her skin was so pale it almost merged with the frost gathering on the edge of the window. Snow dusted the strands of her dark hair, and the trembling of her hands was barely visible beneath the flicker of Jonas's flashlight. Bear was at her side before Jonas could kneel, the dog lowering his massive head until his nose was inches from her cheek. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He simply breathed, one steady exhale that fogged gently over her skin, as if offering warmth his body couldn't spare. Jonas placed 2 fingers on her wrist, ice cold. But a pulse, faint, skipping, irregular, ran beneath the surface like a bird trapped under glass. Her eyelids fluttered at the touch, a small, frightened movement that reminded Jonas of soldiers he had lifted from rubble, people who weren't fully conscious but still fighting to return to the world. A whisper leaked out between her lips. Not a word, more like a breath shaped by fear. Jonas slipped off his glove and pressed his bare palm over her hand. The cold shot into him like a small shock. Her fingers were stiff, curled inward, her nails tinged blue. He wrapped her hand inside both of his, feeling the rough edges of frostbite beginning to form. He didn't ask who she was, didn't ask how long she had been alone. Questions could come later. Breath could not. He lifted her carefully, the blanket trailing behind like a broken wing. Bear walked close enough that his fur brushed Jonas's leg, a living reassurance. Outside, the wind screamed louder, clawing at the trees as the storm finally began its descent. Jonas could feel the weight of the sky shifting, the pressure dropping, the air turning violent. They had minutes, maybe less, before the trail home disappeared. As he stepped back toward the doorway, the woman's head fell lightly against his shoulder. A sound rose from her throat, fragile and pleading, like a single syllable caught on the edge of consciousness. Jonas tightened his grip, adjusting her weight as Bear took the lead, paws punching neat holes in the snow. The world outside had grown dim, as if the storm had swallowed the last of the afternoon. Jonas moved quickly, guided more by muscle memory than vision. Snowflakes slapped against his face, sharp as tiny needles. Bear continued ahead, each step purposeful. The dog didn't look back. but Jonas knew he was listening for every shift in Jonas's breath, every tremble in the woman's body. They reached the truck, and Jonas eased her into the passenger seat, tucking the blanket around her with the precision of someone who had once wrapped bandages on battlefield wounds. Bear jumped into the truck bed, circling once, pressing his body against the cab window as if refusing to let her out of sight. Jonas slammed the door shut. The wind howled. Something cracked in the forest, a branch or something heavier. He couldn't see far enough to know. And maybe it was better that way. Some things are easier to understand in hindsight than in the dark. As he turned the ignition, the woman stirred again, eyes fluttering open for one brief second. In that flicker of time, he saw pain, exhaustion, and a kind of fear that didn't come from the cold. Her lips parted, releasing 4 fragile words. Don't let them return. The engine rumbled to life. Bear's growl answered her. Soft, low, knowing. And in that moment, Jonas understood. They were not alone in this storm. Not yet. Not by a long shot. The door closed behind them with a muffled thud, shutting out the storm like a giant breath held in the throat of the world. Inside Jonas Hale's cabin, the air felt warmer, but still trembling with the cold that clung to the woman he carried, as if winter had woven itself into the very threads of her clothes. The only light came from the hearth, an amber flicker licking at the iron grate, throwing long, slow shadows across the pine-paneled walls. Bear paced once, his paws ticking softly against the floorboards before settling a few steps away. Eyes locked on the stranger with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. Jonas knelt near the fire and eased her onto a wool blanket spread over the rug. She stirred as the heat touched her skin, not with comfort, but with a sharp, instinctive flinch. Like warmth itself was a foreign language she no longer understood. Her eyelids quivered, heavy with exhaustion, and a faint tremor traveled through her shoulders. So slight that only someone who had learned to read the smallest signs of distress would notice. Jonas stayed beside her in silence, waiting for breath to return to her body in its own time, not wanting to startle whatever fragile thread held her present. The crackle of the fire filled the quiet, each pop of sap in the wood sounding like a bone shifting back into place. Outside, the wind slammed against the cabin walls. But in here, the world narrowed to the girl's uneven breathing and the restless adjustment of Bear's stance, as if the dog weighed every second with caution. Jonas reached for a dry coat draped over the armchair and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. Her skin felt almost waxy beneath his fingers, cold lingering beneath the surface like an old bruise. She opened her eyes halfway, just enough to reveal a pair of pale irises clouded with fear. Her lips parted, and the words came out thin as smoke. I was left behind. They panicked. I couldn't move. The sentence broke apart before reaching its end, collapsing into the shallow rhythm of someone who had used the last of her courage simply to speak. Jonas did not respond. He didn't press her with questions, didn't challenge the pieces of her story that trembled too much to stand on their own. He simply draped the coat tighter around her and shifted the logs in the hearth so the flames caught quicker. It wasn't mercy, nor was it trust. It was the habit of a man who had spent years pulling broken lives out of worse places than snow. Bear, however, remained where he was, close enough to intervene, far enough to observe. The dog's ears flicked at each small sound she made, the tilt of his head revealing calculation rather than empathy. He wasn't offering comfort, not yet. He was measuring her. Hours stretched long in the winter quiet. Jonas prepared broth in a cast-iron pot, the steam rising with an earthy, savory scent that slowly replaced the chill in the air. The woman, Elise, he would learn, Soon, sipped in small, hesitant touches, her fingers trembling around the mug despite the heat. Bear watched each motion, his gaze following the arc of her hand, as though mapping intentions Jonas couldn't decipher. When midnight came, Jonas left her resting near the fire while he checked the windows and latched the shutters against the storm. Snow hit the panes like handfuls of thrown gravel, and the wind roared in great sweeping gusts that made the beams creak above his head. But beneath that wild music, he kept hearing Bear's gentle shifting, the soft scrape of claws across wood, the steady pacing of a guardian who sensed something he could not yet name. Jonas lay on the couch for a few hours, drifting in and out of light sleep. But Bear never truly rested. The dog stood watch at the front door, then the back, then the window nearest the fire. Each time Jonas opened his eyes, he saw Bear's silhouette. Rigid, listening, a creature tethered to instinct, older than reasoning. By dawn, the storm had not broken, but its fury softened into a restless whisper. Gray light seeped through the edges of the shutters, pale and cold. Jonas rose with the measured slowness of a man whose bones remembered too many winters. Bear lifted his head, eyes bright despite the long night. Jonas placed a hand on the dog's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of vigilance, and walked toward the hearth. She was awake. Elise sat propped against the low armchair, blanket pooled around her waist, her dark hair falling in damp strands along her cheeks. She wasn't staring into the fire. She wasn't shivering. She was watching the snow drift past the window with a stillness that didn't belong to someone helpless. Something in her expression, some shimmer behind the fog of exhaustion, caught Jonas's attention. A shift, subtle but unmistakable, like the first crack in a layer of ice. When he stepped closer, he saw it again, the small, deliberate flex of a calf muscle beneath the blanket. A movement barely noticeable, but it hit Jonas with the quiet certainty of a truth murmured inside a much larger lie. He didn't speak, didn't reveal that he had seen. Silence often told more than questions, especially when people were balancing between fear and guilt. He knelt by the fire, adding another log. Sparks rose like scattered stars before disappearing into the chimney. He felt her eyes on him, as though she were measuring his silence in return. Her voice arrived softer than before, but clearer, shaped with careful intention. "Thank you for bringing me here." It wasn't quite gratitude. It wasn't quite confession. It hovered somewhere in the middle, where truth often hesitates. Jonas nodded once. Bear, still watching from across the room, lifted his head higher, the fur around his neck bristling slightly, as if reacting not to the words, but to the tone beneath them. Jonas turned to fetch more firewood. The cabin door groaned when he opened it, the cold rushing in like an animal released from its cage. Snow swept at his boots, and the morning air burned sharp in his lungs. He loaded his arms with the wood, the familiar weight grounding him in a way thought could not. When he stepped back inside, the warmth wrapped around him, heavy and comforting. The fire cast long ribbons of light across the floor. Elise had shifted her position, subtle, careful, but enough for Jonas to notice the blanket's edge pulled in a direction she hadn't moved before. Something unspoken hovered between them. Then, without warning, Bear moved. The dog walked toward Elise with a slow, deliberate stride. Nothing hurried, nothing aggressive. Jonas paused mid-step, unsure what had drawn Bear closer. The dog had spent the whole night standing guard, not out of affection, but suspicion. Yet now, Bear stopped directly in front of Elise, studied her with an intensity that stilled the entire room, then lowered his massive head and pressed it gently, almost reverently, against her leg. Elise froze. Jonas did too. Bear didn't offer that gesture lightly. In all the years Jonas had lived with the dog, only one person had ever received that silent oath of trust. Him. The cabin felt suddenly smaller, the air warmer, the storm quieter, as if something unseen had entered with the dawn. Something that did not belong to fear or deception, but to a different kind of truth entirely. And in that stillness, something shifted in Jonas's chest. A recognition, faint but undeniable, that whatever story this woman carried, it had already begun to unravel. The storm did not pass. It merely changed shape, settling into a long, unbroken hush that felt heavier than the nights before. Snow kept falling in small, persistent grains that clung to the windows like frost-bitten fingerprints, and the cold pressed against the cabin walls with a patience that suggested it could wait out any living thing. Jonas Hale woke to the brittle creak of timber, the kind that echoed through empty places inside a man, and moved quietly through the cabin, lighting the lantern, stoking the fire, checking the tools. Elise Rowan was still asleep near the hearth, the blanket rising and falling in slow, tentative breaths. And Bear rested at her feet with his head lifted just enough to monitor her every shift. Jonas carried the broken wheelchair frame to his workbench, laying it down as gently as if it still carried a human weight. The metal was warped, the spokes bent in odd directions, and rust sat deep around the hinges, a sign the chair had not been cared for, only tolerated. He traced the damage with weathered fingers, reading its history the same way he once read fractured armor in faraway deserts. Something had happened to this chair long before the snowstorm, something that left dents where hands had gripped too hard and scratches where floors had not been kind. He retrieved a file and began smoothing the rough edges, the metallic rasp filling the small cabin with a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. Elise stirred at the sound. She lifted her head, her hair falling like a dark curtain across one cheek, and for a long moment she simply watched Jonas work. The firelight warmed her expression, softening the tension that had shaped her since the night she arrived, though it did not erase the shadows beneath her eyes. She seemed to gather courage in slow, steady breaths, as if her words needed help thawing before they reached the air. A whisper slipped across the room, fragile but clear. "My name is Elise." She said it like someone placing a fragile object into another's hands, unsure if it would be kept safe or crushed. Jonas didn't answer right away. He finished smoothing one joint of the frame, wiped the metal shavings from his fingers, and turned just enough for her to see the faint nod that acknowledged her offering. It wasn't an invitation to say more, but it wasn't a boundary either. It was that careful space between two people who had both lost too much to trust easily. Elise looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of the blanket between her fingers. When she finally spoke again, her voice didn't tremble. It sagged, as though releasing a weight she had carried too far. "It was supposed to be a life people envy," she murmured. "A house too big, rooms too quiet, things too expensive to ever feel like mine." Her eyes drifted toward the window, reflecting the pale light like frost. "I kept telling myself fear was normal, that being controlled was the same as being protected. But luxury can feel like a cage if you're the only one inside it." Jonas understood that kind of truth, not through wealth, but through grief. He kept his hands steady on the tools, letting her words settle the way snow does, soft, but persistent enough to change the whole landscape by morning. She drew in a thin breath. "When I finally tried to leave, they didn't chase me. They just left me." Her fingers brushed the broken frame of the wheelchair beside her, the metal cold even in the warm cabin. This was all they thought I needed. The house seemed to inhale with her confession. Bear rose from where he lay, stepping toward her with that careful, deliberate grace he reserved only for wounded beings. He placed his front paws gently on her lap, lifting his head until his eyes met hers, and something in Elise's posture cracked. Not like something breaking, but like something frozen beginning to thaw. Tears slid down her cheek, quiet and unhurried, as if she had forgotten how to cry until now. Bear stayed where he was, a silent sentinel offering the kind of comfort humans rarely manage. Jonas kept working. It wasn't indifference. It was respect. Some pain didn't need witnesses. It needed space. The days stretched on beneath the long hush of snowfall. Jonas repaired the wheelchair piece by piece, tightening bolts, reshaping axles, rethreading old screws that had been stripped by careless hands. Elise stayed near the fire, her eyes following him around the cabin with growing steadiness, as if each repaired joint mended something inside her too. She moved very little, at least when she knew he was watching. But Bear saw more than Jonas did. Saw the small shifts in her posture, saw the tension easing from her shoulders, saw the nights she reached for the blanket with fingers that no longer shook. And Bear reacted to every tear she shed. If her breath hitched, he stood. If her shoulders curled inward, he approached. If she cried, he stepped onto her blankets and pressed his weight against her legs, anchoring her back to the world. Jonas didn't interfere. Bear had always had an instinct stronger than words, stronger than reason, a way of knowing who needed him without being told. One night, Jonas woke to a sound. Soft, quick, not quite footsteps, not quite the shift of blankets. He pushed himself off the couch and followed the faint glow of dying embers toward the corner where he had last seen Elise resting. Bear was there, his body curled protectively between the bed and the window. Ears lifted, gaze fixed on the darkness outside as if expecting someone to emerge from it. Jonas approached quietly, the cabin's boards cool beneath his feet. Elise was asleep, her breath shallow but even, her hand resting unconsciously over Bear's shoulder. It struck Jonas, in that dim half-light, how small she looked, and how fiercely the dog guarded her as if she belonged to his pack. It wasn't only fear of what lay outside. Jonas knew that now. Bear was afraid for her. Morning arrived in thin strands of silver that threaded through the shutters. Elise seemed lighter that day, her voice steadier, her eyes brighter, her posture less fragile. She asked small questions about the cabin, murmured gentle thanks when Jonas refilled her cup, and even let the fire warm her without shrinking away from it. The storm, though unending, had carved a temporary sanctuary between the three of them. Jonas with his quiet patience, Elise with her tentative hope, and Bear with his unwavering devotion. Yet something lingered beneath the surface, an echo of unease that Jonas could not name. It wasn't Elise's story. It wasn't her tears or the way her voice broke when she spoke about the life she had fled. It was the chair. The metal bore marks of force, not accident. The wheels showed uneven wear, as if they had been dragged. The armrests were dented in ways that told of hands pressing too hard, too often. And then there was the way Elise avoided touching it, even once repaired, like it was the last remnant of a life she feared would track her through the snow. Late one evening, Jonas set aside his tools, feeling the strain of the day settle deep into his shoulders. Bear was asleep near the hearth, stretched long and warm against the rug. Elise had retired early, claiming fatigue from the cold. Jonas walked through the cabin, checking windows, securing latches, letting the fire settle into a slow, steady glow. When he returned to the main room, he paused. Elise wasn't in her bed. Jonas stood still, listening for movement. The cabin held its breath around him. Then he saw her, near the window, illuminated by the faint blue sheen of moonlight filtering through the frost. She stood with her back to him, one hand resting lightly on the windowsill, her posture straight, balanced, steady. She wasn't touching the wheelchair. She wasn't leaning on anything. She was standing, fully, easily. Jonas didn't speak, didn't move, just watched the truth bloom in the cold silence of the room, quiet, startling, and fragile as a fracture in ice. The room froze before either of them spoke. Snow tapped against the window in thin, hurried strokes, like fingers insisting on being heard. But Jonas Hale scarcely noticed. His gaze was fixed on the young woman by the glass. Elise Rowan stood trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of a truth she had no strength left to hide. Moonlight rested along her shoulders and cast a faint glow against the steady pulse at her throat. And for a fleeting moment, she looked less like someone who had deceived him than someone who had been deceived by her own fear. She tried to step back, to gather herself, but her breath caught halfway, breaking into a quiet, fractured sound that said more than words ever could. Jonas did not demand explanations. He simply waited, still as the mountain itself, with that practiced patience born from both war and widowhood. The silence stretched long enough for the fire to settle into a low, amber murmur. Elise lifted a hand as if to speak, only to lower it again when the words refused to come. What escaped instead were uneven breaths. Light, rapid, carrying the shape of apologies she didn't know how to form, as if shame had stripped her language down to raw air. Her knees buckled slightly, not from weakness, but from dread, and the trembling worked through her shoulders in soft waves. Bear rose first. The German shepherd stepped between them with a steady, instinctive certainty, his dark coat bristling with confusion, not threat. His ears shifted back as though torn between the two people he trusted, and he let out a low whine, a sound that fell somewhere between worry and defense. Bear nudged Elise's hip with his muzzle, nudging her gently as if to say the truth had not made her less worthy of protection. Jonas watched the scene without moving, feeling something old stir inside him. A reminder that not every betrayal came from malice, and not every truth came free of fear. Before anyone could speak, the night split open. A heavy thrum rolled through the sky, low and distant at first, then rising, beating its way through the storm until the cabin walls vibrated with it. Snow whipped against the roof as if startled. Jonas stepped toward the door, instinct straightening his posture. Searchlights cut across the mountainside, scattering white light through the swirling haze like blades carving open the storm. The sound grew sharper, louder, closer. A helicopter. Bear snapped his head toward the door, a guttural growl brewing in his chest. Elise's breath hitched, her fingers curling into the blanket at her side as she backed away from the window. Jonas opened the door just enough to see the dark blade of the helicopter slicing through the storm overhead. Snow spiraled violently in its wake. The machine descended toward the clearing beyond the tree line, landing with a force that made the ground tremble beneath their feet. The cabin filled with cold air as Jonas stepped outside. The wind tore at his coat, carrying with it a sound he had learned long ago to recognize. The deliberate, confident stride of someone who believed the world owed him answers. Through the blur of frost and headlights, a figure emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a charcoal overcoat tailored too perfectly for these mountains. He moved with the effortless arrogance of a man accustomed to bending rooms, laws, and people to his will. Cole Whitmore, late 30s, sharp jaw, clean shave, dark hair combed back with meticulous precision. His eyes, a steely, possessive gray, swept over the landscape with impatience, narrowing when they landed on the cabin. Snow clung to his expensive boots as he approached, each step announcing that the wilderness itself held no authority over him. The arrogance in his gait wasn't loud. It was practiced, quiet, and all the more dangerous for it. "Of course," he said into the wind, voice smooth and cold as polished marble. "You're here. Where else would you run?" Bear answered before Jonas could. The shepherd lunged forward with a snarl so deep it vibrated through the snow, planting himself between Elise and the approaching man. His teeth flashed beneath the stormlight, eyes locked on Cole with unwavering fury. Not warning, promise. Elise shrank back behind Jonas, clutching his coat with trembling fingers, her breath shaking violently in the open air. Cole stopped a few paces away, dusting snow from his coat with an almost bored motion. "Call off your dog," he said flatly. "He doesn't understand the situation." Jonas didn't move. The wind pressed hard against them, carrying frost that stung the skin, but he held his ground as if rooted to the earth itself. His silence seemed to irritate Cole, whose jaw tightened ever so slightly before he forced a thin, controlled smile. It was the smile of a man who had always gotten what he wanted and believed tonight would be no exception. "Elise," Cole called, keeping his voice low, coaxing. "Come here. You know this is ridiculous." Elise flinched. Jonas's eyes narrowed, reading the truth in her reaction more clearly than any confession. Cole's confidence flickered for the briefest instant, revealing the thin seam of fear beneath. Fear of losing possession, not love. Jonas recognized that type of fear. He had seen it in war, in men desperate to hold on to power slipping from their hands. Cole pressed forward another step. Bear's growl deepened, chest expanding with fury, paws digging into the snow as if anchoring himself to the earth. Elise pressed her forehead into Jonas's back, breath cold and panicked. Cole's voice dropped into something colder, almost amused. "She owes me," he said. "You wouldn't understand. A man like you never does." The words were meant to provoke. Jonas didn't react. His calm, unsettled Cole more than anger would have. The storm howled behind them, tugging at coats and sending small whirlwinds of snow dancing around their feet. But for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to the space between the three of them. A wounded woman, a determined stranger, and a man who had come to reclaim what he believed belonged to him. Another gust tore through the clearing, and the helicopter's blades shifted, scattering harsh white light across Elise's face. Jonas felt her shudder. He leaned slightly to shield her, and in that movement, something inside her seemed to break open. Her voice rose, not loud, not desperate, but raw, shaped by weeks of fear and a single moment of clarity. "Please," she whispered, barely audible over the storm, "don't let me go back." The words drifted upward, fragile and trembling, but they struck with the force of a breaking dam. Jonas heard them. Bear heard them. And for the first time that night, Cole realized he might not leave with the woman he believed he owned. The storm held stillness for one suspended heartbeat. Then the world exhaled. The storm had not yet loosened its grip on the mountain, but the night carried a different kind of stillness. One that settled between Jonas Hale's ribs as he watched Elise clutch Bear's fur with shaking fingers. Her voice had barely faded when Jonas placed a steady hand on her shoulder and guided her toward the back of the cabin. The wind clawed at them in impatient curls, smearing the snow into thin sheets across the porch. But he didn't rush. Each step was deliberate, protective, as if he feared she might shatter beneath the cold. Bear stayed pressed to her side, a silent shadow moving with measured vigilance, the lines of his body tight with instinctive readiness. Even when she stumbled, he adjusted, nudging her forward with a gentleness rarely seen in a dog trained to guard. Jonas opened the small door tucked beneath the eaves, revealing the safe room he had built years earlier from an old root cellar. The walls were lined with thick timber, blankets folded neatly, a lantern casting warm amber across the space. Elise hesitated on the threshold, her breath trembling in shallow bursts, her eyes jumping to Jonas's face in silent question. Jonas simply nodded, offering nothing more than a calm that she seemed to borrow strength from. Bear stepped inside first, circling once before sitting near the cot, gaze fixed on the doorway, like he'd taken a silent oath. When Jonas closed the door behind her, the latch clicked with the softness of a promise. He stood there for a moment, letting his breath settle, letting the cold sharpen the edges of his focus. The storm had thickened, pulling a veil across the sky so dense it swallowed light whole. Jonas stepped back toward the clearing where Cole Whitmore waited, the snow crunching beneath each step like brittle glass. Cole hadn't moved far. He stood with his back half turned, coat rustling in the wind, impatience etched into the rigid lines of his posture. The helicopter loomed behind him, its blades slowing to a restless, heavy churn that stirred snow into spiraling ghosts around his legs. When Jonas approached, Cole didn't speak immediately. He watched the older man with a mixture of irritation and calculation, adjusting his gloves as though preparing to claim something he believed already his. Jonas stopped within arm's reach, not close enough to provoke, not far enough to concede space. His breath fogged between them in slow currents, and when he finally spoke, the words fell steady, unembellished, carried not by force, but by truth. She is not property. It was not loud. It didn't need to be. The words landed with a finality that cut through the storm more sharply than any shout. Cole's jaw tightened, the tendons near his temple twitching as though the statement offended him more deeply than an insult. He stepped forward, not threatening, but asserting, his voice low, oily with entitlement. "You have no idea what she owes me." Jonas didn't blink. His face remained carved in quiet resolve. A stillness that unnerved Cole more than resistance. The wind tugged at Cole's coat as if trying to pull him back. But he planted his heels harder into the ground, fighting the inevitability of losing control. For several long seconds, the storm filled the space between them, drumming against the helicopter's frame, drowning the far-off valley in a wall of white. Cole exhaled sharply, something dark flickering behind his eyes, and then, without another word, he turned toward the aircraft. He climbed aboard with stiff shoulders, but before the door closed, he twisted to throw a final thread of menace back into the night. Something vague, something careful, something shaped like a warning a man of wealth could afford to make without saying anything at all. Then the door slammed shut. The blades roared to life, scattering the snow in violent spirals as the machine lifted, rising into the storm in a blinding, thunderous ascent. Jonas stood in the churn of wind until the helicopter vanished behind the curtain of white, leaving silence and frost in its wake. Inside the cabin, the stillness felt heavy but safe. Jonas returned to the back room and opened the door just enough to see Elise sitting on the edge of the cot, hands clasped tightly in her lap, hair falling in loose strands across her cheeks. Bear sat pressed against her thigh, gaze flicking toward Jonas with a soft rumble of reassurance. Elise looked up, eyes swollen from tears she had tried and failed to hide. For a moment, she held his stare, then nodded faintly, as if to tell him she understood the danger wasn't gone. But the worst had passed. Morning came reluctantly. The storm thinned into soft flakes drifting through a pale sky, the kind of sky that promised warmth but hadn't yet earned it. Jonas woke early, tending the fire, checking the windows, letting the familiar rhythm of labor's stitch calm back into the house. He didn't hear Elise at first. Only when sunlight spilled across the floor did he notice the cabin felt strangely empty. Quieter, air slightly changed. On the kitchen table lay a small folded note. Jonas stared at it for a moment before picking it up, feeling the fragile weight of something more than paper. Elise's handwriting, thin, wavering strokes, spread across the page in sentences broken enough to reveal the trembling behind them. You saved me from my own life. I cannot remain here and break yours in return. Underneath the last line sat another sentence, smaller. If Bear remembers me, give him this. Beside the note, a red rubber ball rested on the wood, worn at the seams, its surface indented from countless hours of being chewed and chased. Jonas lifted it slowly, feeling the faint warmth of Bear's affection pressed into the material. The dog trotted over, nudging Jonas's hand, then pressing his chest against the man's leg. When Jonas set the ball down, Bear curled his paws around it with a tenderness so earnest it struck Jonas harder than the note. He searched the house briefly, but not with urgency. More with the quiet acceptance of a man who had learned that some departures are not desertions, only necessary mercies. Elise was gone, not taken, not chased. Gone by her own choosing, leaving behind only gratitude and a kindness she believed she didn't deserve. A week slipped by. Then two. The snows began to retreat from the pines, dripping in clear beads from their branches. Jonas busied himself repairing fences, mending old tools, walking the ridge with Bear padding faithfully beside him, scanning the horizon with those amber eyes that always seemed to understand more than he could express. Life settled into a pattern almost familiar, though never fully comfortable. Like a wound healing beneath a coat of new skin. The letter arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. The envelope was crisp, stamped by the bank in the nearby town. Jonas brought it inside, tore it open, and felt the ground shift under him as he read. A debt, one that had weighed on him for years, one tied to the night he lost his wife, one that had been both a financial burden and an emotional scar, had been paid in full. The signature at the bottom, Elise Rowan. No explanation, no return address, not even a request for acknowledgement. Just an act of quiet amends from a woman who carried more strength in her silence than most did in their certainty. Jonas folded the letter carefully, setting it on the table beside the red ball that Bear kept close wherever he slept. He walked out to the porch, letting the soft spring wind pass across his face, carrying the faint scent of thawing earth and pine sap. The valley below shimmered with the melting remains of winter. Icicles loosening, water tracing delicate paths through the soil. Branches shaking free of frost in slow, graceful movements. Jonas sank onto the wooden step, elbows resting on his knees, breath easing out in a long, thoughtful exhale. Bear lay beside him, muzzle resting on his paws, eyes half closed, but alert enough to register every shift in the air. The world was quiet in that gentle, tentative way that comes after storms, not triumphant, not relieved, but simply alive again. Then Bear lifted his head. His ears rose, rigid. His eyes narrowed toward the dirt road leading up from the valley. A low thrum of recognition pulsed through his chest before shaping itself into a soft, questioning sound. Jonas straightened, following the dog's gaze. Someone was coming, and the snow thawing beneath the first breath of spring seemed to hold its own breath. There are moments, rare and unannounced, when the world seems to pause between breaths, as if waiting for something soft to happen. That was the feeling on the ridge that morning, in the hush left behind by winter's retreat. The snow receding into thin silver threads across the ground, like memories losing their sharpness. The air tasted of thawing pine and cold soil, the kind of air that nudged the heart toward quiet reckonings. Jonas Hale sat on the porch, elbows resting on his knees, staring down the long dirt road as though it were a vein leading directly back into his life. Bear lay pressed against his boot, chin resting on the wood, eyes half closed but alert, tail giving slow, thoughtful taps against the floorboards. Then the dog lifted his head, ears pricking forward in a sudden, warm certainty that traveled through him like a spark. Jonas felt, rather than heard, the shift in Bear's breathing. The small, almost reverent inhale that animals have when they recognize someone they once held in their heart. Jonas straightened, following Bear's gaze. At first, he saw nothing but the shimmer of early light across the melting snow, the long shadows stretching between the pines like quiet guardians. Then a lone figure appeared at the bend, small against the vastness of the valley, walking with slow, steady steps. The world seemed to soften around her. The woman approaching no longer carried the frantic fragility she had worn like a second skin the night Jonas first found her. Gone were the luxurious coats, the jewelry that glinted like cages in the dark, the careful grooming that belonged to a life lived more for display than for comfort. She wore a simple wool sweater, sleeves slightly frayed at the cuffs, and dark jeans tucked into worn boots. Her hair, once styled to perfection, fell loose around her shoulders, brushed back by the wind in gentle, unplanned waves. Each step she took was quiet, deliberate, not hesitant, but humbled. Elise Rowan. And this time, she looked like someone who had walked through a storm and chosen to leave the wreckage behind. Bear didn't wait for permission. The German shepherd pushed off Jonas's leg with a burst of unrestrained joy, bounding across the slush-covered yard with his tail swinging wildly, kicking flecks of melting snow behind him like bits of laughter. Elise stopped short when she saw the dog racing toward her. Her hand flew to her chest, fingers spreading over the place where fear once lived. Then, as Bear reached her, she dropped to her knees in a single, fluid motion, exhaling a trembling sound that didn't know whether to be a laugh or a sob. Bear pressed himself into her, head forcing its way beneath her chin, front paws wrapping clumsily around her arm as if anchoring himself to proof she was real. Elise's breath broke apart in small shivers as she held him, one hand gripping his fur, the other shaking uncontrollably against his shoulder. Her face lowered into his neck, and for a moment the world around them dissolved. No helicopters, no debts, no threats, no fear. Just reunion. Just the recognition of two beings who had once found each other in the dark and somehow, impossibly, found their way back again. Jonas watched from the porch, unmoving, letting the scene unfold with the reverence a man grants the few miracles life allows. He didn't call her name. He didn't rise to meet her halfway. He simply let her come at her own pace, carrying the weight she chose to return with. When Elise finally stood, she didn't approach him immediately. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater, took a breath that steadied only slightly, and stepped toward the porch with the careful grace of someone walking on unfamiliar ground. She stopped a few feet from him. That distance wasn't fear. It was respect, an acknowledgement of the life she had disrupted, the peace she had borrowed, the hurt she had awakened inside a man, still learning how to let go of ghosts. Elise placed a hand over her heart, fingers curling softly as if trying to protect something fragile beneath. Her eyes, clearer now, no longer clouded by the glazed panic he remembered, lifted to meet his. and something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, remorse, longing, and a quiet kind of courage. "I didn't come back for you to owe me anything," she said. Her voice was barely more than a thread, soft enough that the breeze could have carried it away had she not spoken with such certainty. Jonas didn't respond. He let her speak, allowed her the space to unravel whatever truth she had carried through the miles behind her. "I only wanted—" She swallowed, blinking against the sting rising behind her eyes. "I only wanted to see if Bear still remembered me." Bear answered before Jonas could, circling around Elise's legs, tail brushing her knees, head bumping insistently into her hand. The dog sat between them, looking up with the earnest expectation only a loyal animal could hold. A question in his eyes, as though urging Jonas to close the distance that Elise couldn't. Jonas rose slowly from the porch. His joints ached from the long winter, but the weight he carried as he crossed the few steps toward her came from a deeper place, one tied to loss and healing and the long, painful work of learning to trust the world again. He stopped close enough that he could see the faint freckles across her nose, the delicate tremble in her lower lip, the hope she was trying and failing to hide. He didn't touch her. Instead, he looked at her for a long breath, seeing not the woman he had rescued, not the woman who had run, not the woman who had repaid a debt she didn't owe, just the person standing before him now, humbled, changed, choosing something gentler than the life she came from. "Come in," he said softly. "It's warmer inside." It wasn't an invitation. It was an offering, of shelter, of forgiveness, of a chance at something both of them had thought they'd lost. Elise's shoulders loosened. A tremor left her chest in a slow exhale, and she nodded once, a gesture small enough to be missed, but deep enough to matter. Jonas stepped aside, letting her pass. She paused at the doorway, placing a hand on the frame as though feeling its solidity, as though making sure the moment was real. Then she entered the cabin. The door closed behind them with a quiet thud. Bear settled himself between their chairs near the hearth, tugging his red ball closer with his paws as though claiming his place as the bond that tethered them all together. The fire crackled gently, throwing warm, shifting light across the room, softening the lines of Jonas's face and laying a golden calm across Elise's shoulders. Outside, the last shards of winter slipped from the branches in melting beads. And somewhere in the slow thaw of that afternoon, 3 lives, worn, wounded, wandering, found a small place where the storm could not follow. Sometimes, when a story ends, what lingers is not the storm that shook the walls, nor the shadows that frightened us, but the quiet moments in between, the ones where someone chose kindness when they had every reason to turn away. It's in those gentle choices that we begin to understand how fragile courage can be, and how powerful it becomes when shared. There are people in this world who carry their strength without noise, who stand guard over others the way a loyal dog stands guard over a trembling heart. They don't seek credit. They don't ask for thanks. They simply offer what light they have, even when their own lives are dimmed by old wounds. And maybe that's the quiet miracle hidden in stories like this. A reminder that loyalty still exists, that compassion still matters, and that even the most battered souls can find their way back to warmth when someone believes they deserve it. So if you leave with anything tonight, let it be this small truth. Some of life's greatest heroes walk softly. Some of its bravest acts are never witnessed. And some of its deepest mercies happen in silence, where one human heart chooses to shelter another. In that silence, hope returns. and the world feels just a little more gentle again.